In the 21st century, we're all familiar with cancel culture. It's that whirlwind of online outrage, digital mobs, and the power to deplatform and silence. The term alone sparks fiery debate. Some see it as a necessary tool for accountability, others as just modern-day censorship. But what if I told you the playbook for all this wasn't written on social media, but was perfected centuries ago by the biggest empire in history? Long before online pylons, the British Empire was in the business of systematically silencing dissent, erasing cultures and cancelling anyone who got in its way. This wasn't about social pressure, it was about the brute force of the state, used to control nearly a quarter of the world's land area. While the term cancel culture is new, the tactics of public shaming, silencing opposition, and erasing stories are as old as empire itself. This is the story of how an empire built on conquest also mastered information warfare, pioneering a form of cancellation that was anything but virtual. Now, let's be clear, when we talk about cancel culture today, we usually mean public call-outs and boycotts that might cost someone their job or platform. What the British Empire did was on a completely different scale, but its goal was chillingly similar: control the narrative by getting rid of inconvenient people and their histories. This wasn't social pressure, it was state policy, backed by colonial law and military power. The legal tools of suppression, sedition as a weapon. The British Empire didn't just rule with guns and ships, it ruled with paper and ink. One of its most powerful weapons was the law itself, especially the charge of sedition. The idea was pretty simple: saying or writing anything that could bring into hatred or contempt or excite disaffection towards the government was a crime. In theory, it was to stop rebellion. In practice, it became a handy tool to shut down any and all criticism. Nowhere was this used more than in India. As nationalist movements started gaining traction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the colonial government fired back with repressive press laws. The Vernacular Press Act of 1878 was a particularly nasty piece of work. It specifically went after publications written in Indian languages, creating an unofficial two-tiered system for free speech. English language papers had a bit more leeway, but a nationalist editor writing in Marathi or Bengali could have their printing press seized and face jail time for saying the exact same thing. The point wasn't just to punish, it was to scare everyone else into silence. The Press Act of 1910 took it a step further, forcing publishers the government flagged as risky to pay a big security deposit. If a newspaper published something the authorities called seditious, they could take the deposit and shut the paper down, all without a fair trial. It was financial cancellation designed to make speaking out too expensive. The targets of these laws weren't just fringe radicals, they were the very people we now call the fathers of modern India. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, a passionate nationalist and editor, was tried for sedition twice, his crime, publishing articles that criticised the government's response to a plague epidemic and, later, articles seen as supporting political resistance. In his 1908 trial, the judge called his writings seething with sedition and sentenced him to 6 years of hard labour in Burma. Decades later, Mahatma Gandhi stood in the same courtroom, facing the same charge. In 1922, he was arrested for 3 articles in his journal, Young India, that challenged British rule. In court, Gandhi didn't just plead guilty, he flipped the whole thing on its head. He called the sedition law Section 124A, the prince among the political sections, designed to suppress the liberty of the citizen. By proudly admitting his disaffection for the government, he showed the law for what it was, a tool to cancel any voice that wanted Indian self-rule. He got 6 years. These weren't just a few isolated cases. The sedition law was a key part of the imperial playbook, used against countless journalists, poets, and politicians. It was a legal machine built for one purpose: to completely cancel anti-colonial ideas from public life. If you wouldn't support the empire, you would be legally silenced. Controlling the narrative, the imperial censor. Outside the courtroom, the empire fought a quieter war over information. Britain loved to talk about its free press back home, but it ran a totally different system in the colonies, one built on censorship and repression. This whole system was propped up by racial prejudice, the idea that colonial subjects just weren't mature enough to handle the raw, unfiltered truth. This censorship came in all shapes and sizes. Colonial press laws often required newspapers to put up financial bonds, which could be forfeited if they printed something seditious, making critical reporting a risky business. In Hong Kong, the government monitored and sometimes suppressed Chinese-language papers, especially during periods of instability like the World Wars or when revolution was stirring in mainland China. The invention of cinema in the 20th century was a whole new headache for the authorities. They knew moving pictures could be way more powerful than print, especially for people who couldn't read. In places like northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, racially segregated film censorship was established. Boards were set up to screen films shown to black audiences, and their job was to cut out any scenes that showed violence against white people, riots, rebellion, or telling you everything you need to know, any hint of a romantic relationship between a black person and a white person. The fear was that seeing a white person challenged or shown as anything less than perfect would shatter the myth of racial superiority that the whole colonial project depended on. This wasn't just about stopping riots, it was about shaping how millions of people saw the world. The censors believed that non-white people were easily influenced and had to be protected from dangerous ideas. Any idea that challenged the hierarchy, the thought of a successful rebellion, political equality, or even just a personal relationship across racial lines, was literally cut out of the picture. It was the cancellation of what was possible. This control seeped into everything. Plays, books, and even public meetings were watched closely. In Kenya in the 1920s, the activist Harry Thuku was arrested and deported to a remote part of the colony. The authorities saw his organising against racist policies as a threat to public order, so they just physically removed him, cancelling his message by force. The empire's liberal ideals, so loudly celebrated in London, had a habit of disappearing on the journey overseas. In the colonies, the mission was to control. And control meant keeping a tight grip on information, making sure the only stories being told were the ones that made the empire look good. The message was clear. We'll let your story be told, but only if we get final cut. We're getting into some uncomfortable but really important history here. If you're finding this look at power and control interesting, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We've got a lot more to explore about how the past is still shaping our present. Erasing the evidence. Operation Legacy. Silencing your critics in the present is one thing, but what about the past? What do you do when your empire, built on a story of being a force for good, starts to fall apart? You burn the evidence. As decolonization movements spread across the world after World War II, British officials had a terrifying thought. What if the paperwork, the real, unvarnished records of repression, torture, and secret operations fell into the hands of the new independent governments? Their solution was a top-secret, systematic program to destroy and hide files, a practice that historians now call Operation Legacy. The instructions, which only came to light in the 21st century, are chilling. In 1961, the Colonial Secretary, Ian MacLeod, sent out an order that no new government should get any material that might embarrass Her Majesty's government. This covered anything that could expose spies, but also anything that could embarrass the police, the army, or any colonial official. In each colony, committees were often set up to sort files into two piles, the ones that could be left behind and the ones that had to vanish. The most sensitive files were marked to be either shipped out of the country or destroyed. The instructions were blunt. Emphasis is placed upon destruction, officials in Kenya were told. And to make sure no one knew what they'd done, they were warned that the remaining files must leave no reference to the material that was removed. It was a plan to erase history and then erase the erasure itself. The methods were just as cold. To avoid the suspicious pall of smoke that hung over Delhi for days as documents were burned before Indian independence, officials came up with other ideas. One memo suggested that documents could be packed into weighted crates and dumped in very deep and current-free water at maximum practicable distance from the coast. The empire's sins were literally to be buried at sea. Nowhere was this more critical than in Kenya during the Mau Mau emergency in the 1950s. The British crushed the uprising with incredible brutality. setting up a huge network of detention camps where torture was widespread and sanctioned at high levels. Detainees were subjected to horrific abuse and random killings. The official story, of course, was one of firm but fair policing. When 11 prisoners were beaten to death by guards at the Hola camp in 1959, the government's first story was that the men had died from drinking contaminated water. The truth was hidden in the files. For decades, the full story of this brutality was denied. Historians knew that huge numbers of documents were missing, but the British government insisted they didn't exist. It wasn't until 2011, during a court case brought by elderly Kenyan torture survivors, that the government finally admitted it was hiding a secret archive of 8,800 files from 37 former colonies in a secure facility. These migrated archives laid out the paper trail of abuse in shocking detail, proving the violence was known about and approved at the very top. Operation Legacy was the ultimate act of cancellation. It was a deliberate, centrally directed effort to rewrite history by destroying the primary sources. It was an attempt to make sure that the official, sanitized version of the British Empire, one of progress and civilization, would be the only one left. By burning and hiding the records, the empire tried to cancel its own crimes. It was proof that true power isn't just about winning the battle, but about controlling how it's remembered. Cancelling culture itself. The British Empire's project of cancellation went deeper than just silencing politicians or burning files. It aimed for something much more fundamental: erasing and suppressing entire cultures. This wasn't just a side effect of colonial rule, it was the whole point. The civilizing mission was based on the idea that native cultures were inferior, backward, and needed to be replaced. This cultural cancellation was built on a foundation of scientific racism and a rigid belief that the British were at the top of the ladder of human development. It was their duty, as they saw it, to pull the lesser races up. This worldview justified tearing down traditions, languages, and beliefs that had been around for centuries. In practice, this meant making British norms the default for everyone. Traditional clothing was discouraged. Local languages were pushed aside in schools and government, where English became the language of power. This had a huge effect, creating a class of colonial elites who were often cut off from their own cultural roots. Spiritual and religious beliefs were a major target. Christian missionaries, often working closely with colonial officials, tried to convert heathens. This wasn't just about offering a new faith, it was about destroying old ones. Traditional beliefs were called superstition, rituals were called barbaric, and sacred objects were either destroyed or stolen and put on display in British museums, trophies of a supposedly dying culture. Suppressing culture was also a way to control people. The British banned practices they found disgusting or threatening. In India, they moved to outlaw sati, the practice of widow immolation. While we might see some of these actions as justified today, they were part of a bigger pattern of judging and changing a society based on an outside colonial set of morals. Even back in the 17th century Britain, the Puritan-led government had enforced a strict moral code, banning things like theatre and even Christmas. This impulse to regulate culture and morality found a new and more extreme outlet in the colonies. Even after slavery was formally abolished in 1834, the same logic stuck around. The system of indentured labour, which brought nearly 2 million Indians to colonies in the Caribbean, Africa and the Pacific, was justified by the same racial theories that had propped up slavery. The key difference was that indenture was a fixed-term contract, not permanent ownership, but in practice it often involved coercion and brutal conditions. These communities were then pressured to give up their own cultures and assimilate. By devaluing and actively crushing local cultures, the empire wasn't just taking over land, it was trying to take over the very identity of the people it ruled. It was a profound act of cancellation that declared entire ways of life to be worthless. The goal was to create a new kind of person, a colonial subject who looked to Britain as the one true source of culture, morality and progress. The ultimate win for the empire would be a world that not only spoke English and followed British laws, but also believed that its own history and culture were things to be ashamed of and left behind. So was the British Empire history's first cancel culture. If we're talking about systematic state-sponsored suppression, then the answer is a hard yes. Through sedition laws, it criminalized dissent. Through censorship, it controlled the story. With Operation Legacy, it tried to erase its own crimes from the history books. And with its civilizing mission, it tried to devalue and overwrite the cultures of millions. Of course, it wasn't literally the first empire in history to censor or suppress dissent. Others had done that for centuries, but the British Empire's version is so relevant today because of its scale and its disturbingly familiar logic. This wasn't the social media pile-on we know. It was cancellation with the full backing of the police, the courts, and the army. It was top-down, state-enforced, and often incredibly violent. Today, cancel culture is often described as a weapon of the powerless to hold the powerful accountable. The Empire's version was the exact opposite, a weapon of the powerful to crush the powerless. And yet, the ghost of this imperial thinking haunts our debates today. When we argue about cancelling parts of our history, you can hear the echoes. Think about the toppling of the statue of slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol in 2020. Was it erasing history, as critics claimed? Or was it holding a historical figure accountable, as supporters argued? When the UK's National Trust published a report on the links its properties, including Winston Churchill's home, had to colonialism and slavery, it was accused of pushing a woke agenda to tarnish Britain's history. This argument over shame and erasure is the direct result of the Empire's success in controlling its own story for so long. Operation Legacy and decades of sanitized history books created a powerful myth of a gentle, civilizing empire, a myth that is only now being properly challenged. The tactics have changed, but the fight is the same. Who gets to tell the story? Who decides which statues stand and which fall? Whose history is celebrated and whose is silenced? The British Empire might be gone, but the battle over its legacy and the methods people use to fight it shows that trying to control the past to own the present is a strategy that's very much alive and well. The playbook may have been written in the halls of colonial power, but it's still being used today.